Hello and welcome to the next episode of The Prestige, a podcast about films, filmmaking and film theory.
In each programme, we'll focus on a particular movie, we're going to review it, talk about it, and discuss some of the ideas and themes it throws up.
And as always, we'll end with some recommendations for films to watch following this week's film, based on the cast or the directors or the theme or pretty much anything.
Before we all that, who are we and why should you care? So my colleague on this podcast is Sam Knowles, Dr. Sam Knowles. He is a writer and teacher on all things words and pop culture. He writes about movies, he writes about graphic novels, he writes about anything that is culturally based. I'm Rob Maythorn. I've spent the last 10 years working in the British film industry, working on big-scale productions, little productions, working in the editorial side. And these days I review movies on here and on various websites.
Right. I just wanted to add something, actually. It came out of a conversation that you had with someone on Twitter, which is weird, eavesdropping on people's conversations. But you mentioned there lots of the writing I did, but you also mentioned in passing that I'm a teacher, and that's what I do in my day job. That's what started this week. And similarly, you're hearing Rob's thoughts after 10 years in the movie business. So the aim of this podcast is not always to show off, but is genuinely to educate people and share what we've learnt and what we've derived from our experiences. So just wanted to get that in because it came up in you had a conversation with someone about some references from the podcast, and you mentioned film school.
That was the sort of the initial genesis of this, was kind of like an audio film school kind of thing, and but tied to real world. So each week's tied to a film and tied to ideas about that film, and sometimes tenuous, sometimes they're very sort of core to a lot of cinema experience.
Right, I've digressed long enough, and this week it was your turn.
It was my turn, and I picked the 2000 film High Fidelity, written by Nick Hornby, directed by Stephen Frears, starring John Cusack. It tells the story of Rob, a sort of rough record store owner, and certainly a sort of man-child, you'd say. He and his sort of cohort of equally nerdy and obsessive friends, and about his breakup with his long-term girlfriend and the subsequent fallout and effects of that. It is written by Nick Hornby, whose name you might have heard. He also wrote About a Boy, he wrote Fever Pitch, he wrote An Education. He's written several things, and directed by Stephen Frears, although also a well-known director, done things like Miss Henson Presents, Dirty Pretty Things, The Queen. These are sort of films of our time, and starring John Cusack, who up until kind of the early 2000s made a career out of playing the disaffected, the slightly old loner type, but with the heart of gold. And if you watch his early films, let's say anything, High Fidelity and its companion piece, Grace Went Blank, certainly feel like the grown-up versions of the characters he was playing when he was younger. He has excellent support in the film, I think, from Jack Black, Catherine Zeta-Jones, John Cusack, Tim Robbins. There's a lot of great sort of bit part castings in this, and essentially he goes through a period of looking back at all his long-term breakups, all the top 5, as he calls his top 5 breakups, why they didn't work, and hoping kind of that he can salvage something of his life from those stories. I will say that my description makes it sound far more kind of good-willed than it is. It's quite a misanthropic character. He's very angry at the world, angry at himself. He's that kind of obsessive niche nerd that we all know, and probably I am, that judges everyone around him. And you do have his two shop workers, Jack Black and Todd Luizio, who are very other extremes. That one's very angry, one's very quiet, but they both kind of have that same kind of elitist, isolationist vibe to them. I think that's a good place to jump off. It is a well-known film. Sam, your thoughts?
Yes. I really like this film. I think I may have seen it before, but it was worth seeing again anyway. I may just have memories of reading other Nick Hornby stuff, but I very much enjoy it. I'm watching this. The good thing to come out of this, one good thing to come out of this for me particularly, was remembering just how much I like John Cusack, and also Also, Jack Black. I also I really enjoyed their presentations of these characters, and I think it's right what you're saying about this misanthropic arc to the character. He's very because when you say he decides to go and look back at his former relationships, he does do that, but the reasons he does that are not to do with how could I have been a better person, and how could I have made more complete the life of the person I was with. It's very much a how successful was I in this person's eyes, and you get that. That comes back to this idea that you get throughout the film of top fives, and a top five is always, well, Jack Black puts it, a top five has always got to be a bit quirky. It's always showing yourself in a good light. And Jack Black comes up with top five songs for a funeral, as an example of one. But it's always showing off your own nerd credentials or your own familiarity with the subject to the best effect. So when John Cusack presents his top five all-time breakups, it's got nothing to do with his consideration for, what went wrong here? What did I do? How could I have made these relationships work? It's very much a how can I work out what happened and turn things around to my own advantage. He's a very... I found myself not screaming at the film, but certainly writing in capital letters, how has he not realised it's all his fault at a certain point in the film, when you could see it, you knew why things had gone wrong, you knew exactly why things had gone wrong. And I don't know whether that's... it could be a product of a particular Nick Hornby narrative, but so I think that is what is central to this film, particularly is how his journey from making a relationship all about him and all about his achievements to understanding what went wrong from other people's perspective is very much a growth towards humanity rather than a tongue-in-cheek comedy about going back and touching base with former partners.
But I would agree. I think also it's something that his growth to humanity is almost an accidental thing. It isn't his goal at any point.
No.
He wants validation that he did the right thing, that he was hard done by. All the tales he tells of his breakups are him being dumped and how awful it was. And you see through the film that he did the dumping a lot of the time, and his rose-tinted glasses of his history, almost the opposite, Richard, that they are stories of his woe and how he was hard done by through his entire life. But that isn't the case once you start meeting his exes. Some of them, clearly did break up and break his heart. Some of them went on to marry the person they left him for. Some he literally dumped them.
Yes.
And it's very much you kind of at no point does Rob come across as the hero of the film.
No.
And even at the very final section, almost the third act completion, his only kind of realisation moment is when he almost fucks up again entirely.
Yes.
He almost slips into old ways, and he catches himself and stops himself in time, and that's it. Literally, he doesn't do any better. He just doesn't do worse.
Yes.
But I think Nick Hornby's work in general certainly has this element of men coming to terms with their history and their emotions and their lives in terms of adulthood. But things like Fever Pitch, and About a Boy, all have these themes of modern manhood and what does it mean to be a man. And especially in things like Fever Pitch and High Fidelity, they're all about obsession. Fever Pitch being football, and this being music. But there is the idea that men have this kind of, I can't think, almost a cataloguing mentality of our obsessions.
Yes.
High Fidelity certainly is all about top five, knowing, as you said, knowing all about it, knowing all about the obsession, and kind of how do you correlate that, and how do you come to terms with being in a relationship where it isn't all about being right or knowing the most?
Yes.
And it does feel like that kind of, we talked about this a little bit last week on Trainwreck, not a modern rom-com, but a sort of a grown-up rom-com. It feels messy and it feels awkward in that no one's really right, and even his girlfriend who leaves him could easily be portrayed as, the queen and the glorious one who left him because he was a mess. She's equally messed up, and she isn't in any way the heroine of the film. I mean, she isn't she's a good person, but she does things in the film where you're like, well, that doesn't make me like you in any way.
No.
Some of his exes certainly come across in quite a nice manner, but some of them don't. It was strange that they, I suppose, the message of the film being kind of coming to terms with who you are. There's a great scene in which he's written his top 5 jobs he could have in the world. And there are things like record producer in the 70s, obviously on a Rolling Stone interviewer in the 70s, and it ends up with architect on the last list, because he can't think of anything else he'd rather have. Despite that, he owns a record store. And the arc of the film, as I saw it, was him kind of coming to terms with who he was. And his coming to terms with that was what brought him back with his girlfriend. It wasn't about his growth. It wasn't about him becoming a different person in the way many rom-coms are. Like, most of the characters end the film the same person they start the film at. But they have this moment where they kind of come to terms with who they are and what their life is. And to me, one of the most telling speeches in it was a speech that he gives about women's underwear, which is a strange thing to say. But it goes on about how the women in his fantasies are all in basically lingerie. And his girlfriend, it's always cotton pants that have been worn 1,000 times and washed 1,000 times. And the idea of living in this fantasy world where all women wear lingerie all the time, to him has always been the seductive allure of that. And his coming to terms with reality where actually everybody has the grey pants they've worn 1,000 times, and everybody has this real person behind the fantasy. And his journey is, I felt to me, like coming to terms with that.
Going back to the top 5 list that you mentioned, and also this idea of conscious sense or something. Ponzi theory alert. This just came to me. This may be utterly ridiculous, but the fact that he mentions 4 jobs which are beyond the bounds of possibility. They're all historical jobs, and then, as you said, the 5th job is an architect. Even though he owns a record store, even though he doesn't really want to be an architect.
No.
In the real world. So my Ponzi theory is that this film is about him, his journey towards building himself. Like, this idea of being an architect is him building a home for himself, and that's what this film is about.
I can see that. I think that it's also worth noting that to back up your Ponzi theory, that the other jobs on the list are all about being near greatness.
Yes,
they're all about him being a reporter. It's like they are about being a reporter or being a record producer,
but also never too close to greatness.
No,
it's always sort of, I could be a guitarist with so and so and so and so, but maybe I'm never going to be as good as him, or I'm never going to touch greatness like that.
He does this musician, but it's just, he doesn't want to be famous, he wants to be a musician, and it's all about being next to the thing that he thinks is good and the externalization of adoration, I suppose. And I think part of that is linked to, as I said earlier, with him being beaten down all his life. But he's under this impression that he's never going to get to the fantasy, he's never going to get this dream, and he's got to live in this role that's been assigned to him. And the end of the film is about him coming to terms with the fact that this isn't an assigned role, it's a role he's chosen, and he has this sort of the arc where he starts to produce an album for some like kids locally, rather than being just the seller of it. And it's kind of him coming to terms with what he can and can't do, and making the choice to do them. So it isn't about, I've got to do this because this is my role, this is the hand that life dealt me, and it's terrible, but it's all I've got. And it's him coming to terms with, you know what, yes, like this is where I am, and I'm going to make myself a person who loves this world, and seeing obviously it for what it is. I think that it obviously does the top 5 thing. I don't know whether, without wishing to kind of play into any kind of gender roles here, it does feel like a very male thing. It does feel like a very male, and this does feel like a rom-com about being a man for men, and that is a wild stab in the gender politics dark. I'm well aware of that, but it did feel kind of aimed at the masculine experience, certainly, and the masculine nerdy experience in detail.
I wonder why. This is me musing out loud. I have no idea what the answer is, but why the masculine nerdy experience leans towards cataloguing this way, and the feminine nerdy experience would maybe not do that. I speak in very, very broad brushstrokes, so I apologise to anyone who falls outside these categories. But in my experience of nerddom, which is extensive in many ways,
male nerds tend to fall into this categorization of knowing all about it. I'll hold up my hand and say that I remember as a kid going through the specs of Enterprise and knowing about all the bits and bobs and all the history, and I will happily spend hours reading, the fictional history of country. I've got a book in front of me now, A Fictional History of Westeros from Game of Thrones, and I would delve into that. The female nerd experience tends to be much more creative, in my experience. They're the ones who write fan fiction. They are the ones who devour fan fiction. They're the ones who make art. They're the ones who twist the world to their thing. So a lot of the art you see, when it's set in that world particularly, tends to be for male audiences, or male creator. When they've done the mashup or the doing it in a different world or changing it around, tends more towards the female experience. Once again, broad brushstrokes, so I apologise if anyone feels like solo. And I'm in no way gender scholar to be able to say why things fall down that line, but it is noticeable that the men certainly feel on the nerdier side of things, and that's how, I don't know whether you score points and whether it's kind of a more of a combative nature of how we're raised as genders. But obviously you can score points when you know more, but it's very hard to score points when you are doing a creative way of doing things, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I remember being in my 30s and going to nerd conventions sort of 15 years ago. It was all about trivia, and it was all about knowing more. And that was how you scored the kudos points among your friends. Like telling a friend a bit of trivia he didn't know, was you felt great doing it, and generally they felt great getting it because it was more information. And that
Can I just pick up on something that people may have heard? You just said in your 30s 15 years ago. How old are you?
I'm in my 30s now, and I started going. My first convention I went to when I was 14, so that was 18 years ago.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, that was me tripping over my words. I think also that there's just to jump topics a little bit. There is a element of this film that is unusual, and that's what I'd call the soundtrack.
Right.
But as opposed to the score, this film almost doesn't have a score. The soundtrack is the score, which is unusual in films. Most films will have an element of score. And just for those who, the difference is soundtrack tends to be songs that exist anyway. Score tends to be the orchestral or the instrumental music that kind of beds under scenes. Yes.
Yeah. So the soundtrack will be immediately recognisable as from other sources, whereas you'll get the score to The Hunt for Red October or Jurassic Park, and that will be immediately recognisable as this set movie theme.
Yes, I think it's understandable to see why in this film we get a soundtrack rather than a score, given the content. But I thought it was very interesting that I'm trying to think of other films that play with this trick of having almost entirely a soundtrack but no score.
I'm not sure. I'll let you think about that. I would pick up on that use of the music or use of songs kicking in at particular points, and when Rob makes a discovery fairly early on about his girlfriend Laura, he flips and the music changes abruptly, and we get another song intruding, another song being introduced, and then you have things like the words of the songs are very noticeable. Like the line "Won't somebody please help me with my misery" is one I wrote down. That the soundtrack in that respect matches the film and matches what's going on.
I think you also got the sort of part of that is what is it didactic? Didactic and not music, I think it is. So one, music is in the scene, so the characters themselves are hearing it as well. Being a record store, I think I'm using the right term there, but basically this is music that's in the record store. So a lot of the music comes from the actual scenes they're in. But you're right, they do change that occasionally, and you think you're listening to something that they're listening to, and then you're not, because they're mixing it in with the sort of the story going on. And I think this once again ties back to, as we were saying, about the sort of the nerdy experience and the pop culture experience, because there's a element of recognition occasionally, because they do pick some very popular songs, but also some slightly less popular songs you might not have heard of, but you might have heard of them, and there's an element of like, oh yeah, I know this song. There's a bit where he goes, I will now sell 3 copies of the Beatles Band. And he puts on a track by Beatles Band, and it is the most famous track. It's a very good track, but unless you were into music at a certain time in your life and are of a certain age, it is a song that could have easily passed you by. And Sam and I are both white guys in our 30s, so we know that song. But someone 5 years younger than us may never have heard of it, and my parents certainly never heard of it. And there is that element of like, oh, I'm on the inside here. I get why they're doing that, and you kind of, it feels like you're kind of in the club, but there's an element of kind of inclusiveness from exclusiveness.
In that respect, this is a really clever film. This is in that idea of sort of taking a song and playing on this idea of inclusiveness and basically inserting a song as an object that means something to its audience as well as to the audience in the film. It's a really clever film, and you don't get many others that do that. They get the music working in several ways. It's not just music working for the benefit of the viewer, it's music working for the benefit of the viewer and for the benefit of those in the film.
Yeah, I think the use of music is very, very interesting thing. I think it's something to say. It's one thing we should talk about this week. I think you're right. It does some very clever tricks, and a lot of the film is flashback. So you see flashback to his early relationships, and you kind of see his changing style. So there's bits where he's very punk. There's some bits where he's much more kind of Axl Rose rock. And in those scenes, I made a note that almost all the music you hear in those scenes is right for the era.
Right.
So they clearly set this film in 2000. Said he's in his 30s, and so they counted back to when he was 12, when he was 16, when he was 17, and the songs you hear are of those era. And I wonder whether this is one of those films that you and I are going to love because we're a similar age bracket and we're a similar kind of lifestyle. But if we were to show it to, I don't know, a inner city kid who's 15, if you would have any kind of resonance with them because of that kind of that disconnect between our cultural experience, which was not exact, close enough, and their cultural experience. And if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah. Also, though, there's a particular. I'm trying to work out how to phrase this, but you and I were not 32 when this film came out.
No.
As John Cusack was. Well, he was around. He was like 33, 34. But this film, because of that very careful selection of music for the flashback scenes, for his development in the film, this use of music is very particular to someone who was 30-ish when the film came out. But because you and I have been exposed to films of the late 90s and early 2000s, we have kind of adopted the cultural tastes of a generation ahead of us. Do you see what I mean? That we appreciate things that we shouldn't really appreciate because of film.
I see what you're saying, but I think there's almost a much longer white podcast here of, if you look at something like high school films, as which we'll touch on at some point on this, high school films tend to take 2 years to make, and they're made by people in their 30s and 40s, for people who are 14 upwards, about people who are 17 upwards. And there's a whole world in there of who's setting that culture. You know, I remember watching American Pie as a kid, and probably being a little bit too young to be the characters in American Pie. But in that way, I was the target market for it.
Yeah.
But it was written 3 years before it came out. It was made by people, actors were in their 20s, director was in their 40s. You know, like, there's a weird disconnect of like, yes, we are the right age group to be the characters in this film, but that isn't to say it wasn't actually aimed at us, and maybe that's how a lot of culture works, in that we're always aiming for that little bit higher, or occasionally that little bit lower. I know, like, just to jump to the TV show Skins, when that came out, I was probably a little bit too old to be a character in Skins, but everyone in my age group watched it, and you kind of there's always that harkening back and forth that every generation kind of crosses into other generations, sort of media and cultural zeitgeists.
Yeah.
But I think one week we'll do a week on high school films and cover all of that in detail.
Yes. Well, just one thing about high school films, and this could be why it's often so difficult to make a sequel to a high school film, because if there are characters who are 17, 18 being played by 22, 23-year-olds, then you've got 2 years of production and post-production, and then another 6 months for it to be released and gain popularity, and for a sequel to be greenlit, and then you've got another 2 years of production. So by the end of filming, these are going to be sort of 25, 26-year-olds, and you're going to have a John Travolta in Grease 2 sort of thing.
And the moment's gone often. It's not like American Pie, which really was a home run culturally-wise. 2 and 3, whilst being fun films, never quite
Yeah.
got it together. And I think 3. I'm trying to think about what happened in 3, but even I think 3 was actively awful. And I think 3 is The Wedding. That was a terrible film, and it just it's one of those like this is where you get into the world of terrible sequels. It's because the moment goes. Films exist for a certain moment, and some surpass that, but very much the sequelitis that we experience is often because the initial moment worked brilliantly in the that year it came out, but then it just kind of passes. So Sam, as always, we kind of end with some recommendations.
Yes.
This week, what have you got for us?
Well, this week, not so much 2 recommendations, but more. One of my recommendations is sort of a smorgasbord of John Cusack films.
Okay.
I think that John Cusack is an underrated actor, and I particularly enjoyed his films ranging between sort of 98 and 2001. So I like Grosse Pointe Blank, I like this, I like Pushing Tin. I think Pushing Tin's a brilliant film.
Underrated, certainly.
Very underrated, and I think that was... if I had to stick with one recommendation, I'd go with that. But I wanted to mention Serendipity, which I think's all right. So I would just say anything with John Cusack in. Certainly from that period that you mentioned at the beginning as being his sort of... the end of his... or the beginning of his shift to another character. This idea of playing someone with a heart of gold. That'd be one. My other recommendation, completely off-piste, but it's another film that uses music to punctuate action very well. And it's certainly not the same genre-wise, and it's not really the same. We're not talking about pop culture here, but it's the mid-80s film Amadeus. That is another film that uses music brilliantly. I'm not comparing it, it's not as good as High Fidelity, but it's an interesting one to watch in terms of thinking about the way that a soundtrack can be used.
I would echo that. Amadeus, it's a very interesting film. It's not. I'm not a huge fan of it, but I think it's a very interesting film to watch. And if you're looking at films that might push your sort of cinema experience, it's working out. I've almost mimicked you in having a Cusack film and a non-Cusack film.
Okay.
The Cusack film I've picked is well before your current sort of era. It's from 1985, and it's a film called Better Off Dead. He's a teenager. He's very much playing the proto Rob Gordon, the proto Martin Blank. It's his teenage films. His girlfriend dumps him. Family crises emerge. It's very much like a probably high school film, and was one of the films that really kind of launched him as a kind of leading man and that kind of say anything pre-2000 era. And I think it's one of the ones often forgotten outside America, and it's worth checking out. I think it's very much an 80s high school film in that kind of genre, but it's worth watching. And secondly, I've got another film that's all about music, and I think whilst it has more of a score, it still uses music greatly, and that's Almost Famous.
Great film. I really enjoyed that film.
I'm a huge fan of it. It's the year 2000, so same year as High Fidelity. Cameron Crowe, about a journalist in the 70s, a kid being a journalist in the 70s, dealing with this kind of classic rock era. It is loose and it is rambly, but it is about being a music nerd. It is about being the guy outside the creative, but also being obsessed with the creative, and how that obsession takes various forms. In his world, it's kind of knowing all the songs, and then you've got people like Kate Hudson playing Penny Lane, who's a groupie, and all the levels of obsession, and even from the artist's point of view, their obsession with making the music. It's a beautifully written film, a beautifully shot film. I would highly recommend it, and at some point I do want to cover it on the podcast itself. But for this week, it is my recommendation. Can
we just pause and remember how good-looking Kate Hudson was in the year 2000?
She really was.
Next week is my choice.
It is.
And I would like us to watch I believe it's the same year as High Fidelity, also 2000 film, Sexy Beast.
Sexy, wow. And
I think, given the renaissance in gangster films and Legend coming out this week, the Tom Hardy film That Craze, and also the preponderance of gangster TV series on Netflix with Breaking Bad, Sons of Anarchy and other things. I think Sexy Beast is a really good one to look at.
Sounds awesome.
Do get in touch with us on Twitter. You can find me at life_academic.
You can find me at Rob Kaiju.
or you can find the podcast itself at the Prestige Podcast. That's at Prestige Podcast. And I would just say we got a great bit of feedback from someone on Twitter. Matt Wander's got in touch to talk more about hard and soft sci-fi from your discussion of that, thinking about Looper. And I was both gratified to get this feedback and also a bit confused because I don't know about hard and soft sci-fi, and that was your area.
Yes.
So you and Matt need to have a chat because he knows a lot about that, and so do you. So thanks for that. It's very much appreciated, and do get in touch, anyone who would like to.
And we will see you guys back here next week.
Bye.
Prestige is a Kaiju Industries production. Check out their other work at facebook.com/Kaiju Industries. Rawr! Arg.